why is it the onus of westernized nations to really clamp down on this commodification of the birthing process and of children, of human beings?
Well, I mean, I know that, for example, in some parts of the States, commercial surrogacy is legal, whereas it isn't in others, and it isn't in most European countries. But I think one has to ask the question, and I do ask this a lot throughout my book, is if it is not acceptable in your country, why is it acceptable in someone else's? And if you know in your heart that you would never accept that sort of treatment of a woman in America or that treatment of a woman in Britain, why would you accept it somewhere else? And why would you encourage it and use it? You know, I can't imagine many British couples would be comfortable with the idea of women from, say, the poorest areas of Britain going into dormitory style hospitals, being impregnated with other people's babies, and then their babies being taken away from them without them having any say whatsoever. I think there would be a huge outcry about that. But it's a form of neocolonialism. If you wouldn't accept your own people going through that, but you're perfectly happy to exploit a woman in another country. So yes, I do think this is something that the West has got to deal with.
So you mentioned that in your book, this form of neocolonialism, and I hear that batted around a lot in various aspects. Could you expound on how this is, like, what is colonialism? What is neocolonialism? How is this a prime example of that?
Well, I tend to talk about it a lot in the book in relation to population control policies, where I do feel there is a direct link with old style colonialism, that we still have the notion that we need to tell people in other countries what to do and how to live their lives. In this particular case, I think it's a similar principle. I think we have different rules in our minds when it comes to the way we expect to be treated and the way other people in other countries should be treated. And if we're making that sort of distinction, that is a form of discrimination. I talk about it as well in terms of the population control policies in China. An awful lot of people in the West excuse and even support China's population control policies. And yet the question I ask is always, well, how would you feel if you had to tell your manager every time you had your period? Would you really want to be embarrassed like that? How would you feel if you had to apply to your local council for a permit to have a baby? Mm-hmm. You know, how would you like it if having a baby became an act of political defiance? Would you want to see your neighbours dragged out of their houses and forcibly aborted? Is that the sort of world you would be prepared to live in? If you find it shocking for that to happen in London or San Francisco or Paris, then why is it not shocking to you that that happens in Beijing? You know, I'm asking people to take a truly international view.
To build off that, feel free to get or to refrain from getting as political as you'd like. Last year, there was outrage about a British court ruling that a mentally handicapped woman had to have an abortion. Yeah. I forget her name. I forget the specifics.
No, I do remember.
The way I remember it was like on a Friday that ruling came out. There was a huge uproar over the weekend. Monday it was appealed and a superior court overturned it. Yeah. Thankfully, she did not have to get her an abortion, but they did rule that she had to become forcibly sterilized.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, we were all extremely relieved when the initial judgment was overturned about the forced abortion, because, well, there is a history, there is a eugenics history in Europe, not in Britain specifically, but it was very shocking to me that she could be forcibly sterilized, because that is also part of our eugenics past. And I think, you know, as well as talking about our colonial history, we also have to look at the way we have treated our own people in the past. And certainly Britain avoided a eugenics law, thanks to G.K. Chesterton, incidentally.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, what people forget when we talk about eugenics, we tend to talk about Nazi Germany because it was the ultimate proponent of eugenics with the Action T projects and things like that. But of course, it did happen in the US. It happened in Sweden, in liberal Sweden, right up to the 1970s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There were people being forcibly sterilized because they were deemed to be feeble-minded or to have a handicap. I mean, there was one particularly tragic case of a girl who was sterilized because she couldn't read the board because they didn't realize she didn't have her glasses. And she was forcibly sterilized on those grounds. We've had in parts of Eastern Europe the forcible sterilization of Roma families, Roma women, after the birth of a first child. So, this is something that is as much part of our heritage as it may be part of our terrible future if we don't learn from the past. Britain very nearly had a eugenics law. It was supported by some very high-profile people, including H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, who was a well-known eugenicist. Churchill was, given that he's now famous for fighting Nazism, was also in favour of eugenics. And G.K. Chesterton found out about this proposed law, and he had a series of public meetings around the country, and he whipped up a huge amount of opposition, and it fell down in the first hurdle. So we could quite easily have had a eugenics law of our own in Britain, and it's something we should be aware of. And so when I heard that somebody was going to be forcibly sterilized, that's the first thing I thought of, was that, are we regressing? We didn't succeed in doing this in the 1930s like so many other countries did. Are we really going to fall down this road in the 21st century? And yet, in some respects, it shouldn't be a big surprise, because a significant minority of women who have abortions in this country admit that they are unwanted abortions. So we are already promoting coercive abortion on some level in pretty much any country where abortion is legal, if you think about it.
And by that, you mean a pregnancy may be unwanted for a slew of reasons. One of them may be the financial constraints. And so if there's any reason like that, that could be seen as a form of coercion. Like, hey, you really just can't handle this. Maybe you should just get rid of it. Okay.
Well, there are a lot of ways in which coercion happens. One of them is, say, financial constraints, for example. It is, in fact, illegal in this country to have an abortion on those grounds. So... Yes, I mean, because technically, at the moment at least, in Britain, abortion is not legal. It is decriminalised, which means that it is permitted in. I mean, it may seem like a point of semantics, but it's actually quite important. There is no right to an abortion. It's not like in the US where you had Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
There is no right to an abortion in Britain. There are certain circumstances where abortion is permitted. Financial reasons are not grounds for an abortion in Britain. So when you get abortion facilities claiming to feel so sad because a woman's come to them for an abortion because she can't afford the baby, what they are at least technically admitting to is performing an illegal abortion. And, if there really is a case where a woman is coming crying to an abortion facility who doesn't want to have the abortion, but she can't afford the baby, they know there are places they can send that woman to. I know numerous crisis pregnancy centres around the country who would help a woman like that, and who do help women like that. But with buffer zone legislation coming out, making it harder and harder to reach women in those situations, it's actually getting harder to reach out to women with information about the alternatives. But when it comes to coercion, it can sometimes be a case that someone else makes the decision. The boyfriend makes the decision, the husband makes the decision, the doctor makes the decision. How many cases have you heard of where, a woman's boyfriend says, well, I'll leave you if you don't have it, if you don't have the abortion. You don't want to have the baby, do you? How many girls have abortions when they're very young because they're frightened of their parents finding out? When you stop to think in terms of what constitutes consent. Another issue I look at in my book, because of my English language background, I'm very interested in the way we use language. If the literature handed out to women about abortion isn't in itself accurate, then how can we talk about consent if we're not talking about informed consent? In real terms, what proportion of women really are fully and freely consenting to abortion.